So welcome to a crash course in Object-Oriented PHP for beginners. This is going to be a video that just kind of gets people into Object-Oriented PHP in a very easy and smooth way. So you can learn what and how to use Object-Oriented PHP together with your PHP applications in the same sense as you would using procedural code. So this is going to be a very beginner-friendly introduction to Object-Oriented PHP. And the main focus here is to not just explain how to program Object-Oriented PHP, but also explain exactly why we do the different things we do inside Object-Oriented PHP, because the why is just as important as how when you get started. Otherwise, you don't really connect the dots and you don't really see, okay, so I know how to create classes and objects, but how can we use this instead of procedural PHP? And that's really the big question here that I often get people asking, because one of the hardest things for beginners is to see the connection and see how we can implement Object-Oriented PHP instead of procedural PHP. So that is what I'm going to focus on in this video here. So we're going to do a crash course, we're going to talk about what classes are, how to create objects, and we will even do a small example where I show you how to do something that you will know how to do using procedural PHP, but do it instead using Object-Oriented PHP. So let's go and get started in a very easy and for you to understand way if you've never seen Object-Oriented PHP before. So as you can see in front of me here, I have a very basic index page. There's nothing specific inside of it. It's just a pure HTML index page, or it's a index.php file, but we don't have any PHP inside the page itself. So if I were to go inside this page and just do something that you have seen before, which is just procedural PHP, I were to go inside the body tags here and open up my PHP tags, and we can go inside these PHP tags. We might be able to create a variable. We could call this something like brand. Then we can set it equal to a car brand. In this case, we could say Volvo. Then we can close it off here. We can copy it down to the next line, and we can change the second one to something like color. Then we can say color is going to be equal to green. And let's also go and create a function, because a function is a very basic thing. You know how to create functions by now, because that is just basic procedural PHP. So if we were to go down and actually create a function, and now that I'm typing this, I realize that I haven't really talked about what is procedural PHP and what is object-oriented PHP, because some beginners may not know that there is something called procedural and object-oriented PHP. I mean, you do know there's something called object-oriented, otherwise you haven't clicked this video. But what we're creating right now here is something called procedural PHP, because we just procedurally generated or created as we need to use it inside our web page. So right now I need to have these variables here and I need to have this function here. So I'm just going to go and create them here since I need to use them here. So in this case here, let's go and call this function something like getCarInfo. Now I would need to pass in the variables inside my function, because we need to do that, because that is the basics of functions. So if I need to use these, I need to go inside and pass it in as a parameter. So just going to go ahead and pass them in. And then inside the function, we could say something like return brand, and then we return the brand, and then we say color, and then return the color. And then we basically, when we output this inside our website, so if we would actually go ahead and echo out this function down here, so we can say echo get car info. We're going to pass in our parameters, so we can actually say brand, and then we can say color. And if I were to output this inside my website, you'll notice that we get a very basic sentence. We get brand, Volvo, color, green, right? This is basic PHP that you've learned up until now, but this is what we call procedural PHP. So let's go ahead and take this example here and talk a bit about how we can create object-oriented PHP programming in order to get the same effect, but using classes and objects instead. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go inside our directory and we're going to create a new folder. And this folder is going to be called classes. Now, just know that this is something we do for the sake of this exercise here, because you need to know about how to create classes and objects and this kind of thing. But typically we would have namespaces inside our directory. We would actually have different categories where we could categorize our classes inside of them, so we have things a little bit more systemized. But for now, let's just go and create a classes folder, which are going to have classes inside of them. So we're going to go inside this folder and create a new file. I'm going to call this one car.php. Do note my spelling here, because I did actually capitalize the C, because this is going to contain a class called car And the naming convention for classes is to capitalize the first letter. And in the same sense, when it comes to the file, we do the same thing. So I'm going to say car with a capitalized C, and then I'm going to say we create this file here. Inside the file itself, we're going to open up the PHP tag, since we do actually need to have PHP code in here. And I'm not going to close the PHP tag because, again, if you know basic PHP, when you have a pure PHP file, it is better not to have the closing tag, otherwise you may get unexpected errors. So again, if you do have questions about this, I do have a procedural PHP course for beginners that you can watch where I cover what this is and why we do it this way. But inside of here, we're going to learn how to create a class. Now, to explain exactly what a class is basically a template or blueprint, you could call it. So let's take a real life example. Let's say we have a factory that produces cars, and inside this factory we have a machine that has a blueprint of how a car is supposed to be built. So as long as we have this blueprint, we can print out as many cars as we want based on that blueprint. And inside the blueprint, we might have a couple of empty spaces where, for example, the color is something that we can decide. So we don't have to have all the cars being one specific color, but we can actually change that if we want to. But we essentially have this basic blueprint, and that is what a class is. So let's say I go in here and I create a class, and we could do that by defining a class, going in, giving it a name. In this case here, it's going to be car, which is the same name as my file over here. Again, notice the capitalized C. Then I'm going to go after and write curly brackets. And this is how we can create a basic class. Now, inside a class, we have something called properties and methods. We do also have something called fields, but PHP is a little bit different when it comes to naming different things inside a class compared to maybe something like C#, which is another programming language. But just know that we have something called a property and a method inside a class. And I'm going to piss off some of the more experienced developers now, because I'm going to tell the beginners here that you should see a property and a method in the same way as you do as a variable and a function, which is not true. By the way, they're not the same thing, but it's a very similar comparison that I can make for people to understand what exactly a property and a method are. So a property is the same thing as a variable, and a method is the same thing as a function. So now a property is basically information about a particular object. So right now we're trying to make a car, right? Because we have a class named car. So information about a car could, for example, be the brand, the color, the vehicle type, is this a car or is it a truck? What is it? So just basic information about this particular object in here. But now a method, just like a function, is when we want the car to do something. So we want it to print out something inside the website or do something specific. We have functions that can do things inside a website. And that is kind of the same thing as what methods are. But a method is just functions inside a object that are related to this particular object. So with this in mind, let's actually go and create some properties inside this class here. Now, in order to do that, we have to talk about something called visibility modifiers. A visibility modifier is essentially a way for us to go inside a class and then say who has access to this information. So who has access to the properties and the methods. Because inside object-oriented programming, we have something called encapsulation, which basically means that we take code and we encapsulate it inside, for example, a class. So only certain things have access to that particular piece of code. So in this sort of way, we have better control over what exactly is happening to the code, who has access to it. Is there some sort of code that is a little bit more sensitive than others? Well, okay, then maybe some particular classes should not have access to this code. So in this sort of way, we can encapsulate code using object-oriented programming. So in order to talk about this, we need to talk about these visibility modifiers. So basically, let's go ahead and create a property here just to begin with. I am going to do the same thing as we did inside the index page where we created a brand, we created a color, and then later on we're going to go ahead and create this function, but as a method inside that particular class we just created. So we're going to take these two variables here. I'm just going to copy it, go inside my class and paste them in. And immediately you can see some error messages, and that's because we haven't actually created these visibility modifiers yet that we will create in just a second. But basically what we have to do here is we need to actually make sure that we defined who has access to this information here. So right now I could say that this is going to be private. So if it's private, it means that only this class called car has access to this information here. So if we would actually copy this down and say this is also going to be private and save it, you can see, oh, no more error messages because now we have created properties in the proper way. But now let's say I want to make sure that not just this class here, but maybe also another class that is a child class of this class here has access to these properties as well. Well, what you can do is you can create, instead of a private property, is you can create something called a protected property, which now means that not just this class here, but another child class that extends to this class has access to this property as well. And you might already be thinking, well, Daniel, you're skipping ahead a little bit here. What is a child class and what does extending to this class mean? We'll get to that, okay? So just don't worry about it right now. Just know that we do have a protection level or a visibility modifier called protected. That means that other classes that extend to this class has access to this information. So any class that is not a child class of this class do not have access to this information. That would be the same way as just putting private, okay? But then we do also have something called public, which means that everyone has access to this information here. But now that's also kind of where we run into a small issue that I see happen quite often when people, they create classes and objects, because the thing is, the reason we have classes is to encapsulate data. And one of the big benefits of encapsulating data inside a class is that we say, well, okay, so we have information inside this class. And what we want to do here is we want to make sure that we only have access to this information if we have a reason to. And one of the things that I see people, they do as a default is to go inside their class and all the properties inside their class. They're just going to make everything public, and that way, oh, everything can be accessed. And hey, we can just use all this information anywhere inside our code. Hooray, right? Well, that is not what you're supposed to be doing. That is a bad habit of people to have. What you should be doing is go in and make everything private as a default. And then from here, you need to ask yourself, okay, inside this particular code, is there a reason for anything outside this class to have access to these pieces of information? Because if there isn't a reason, then don't make it public. If you don't fully understand private, protected, public yet, don't worry, we will get to do examples where you'll, have this epiphany moment where you say, oh, okay, so that's why we need to make it private and protected and public. So we will get to it. For now, just know that the only thing that can access these different pieces of information or these properties here is this particular class here. So the car class that we have right now. I do also want to point another thing out here, which is that right now you can actually see that I assigned some data to these different properties. So the thing is that typically when we have these different properties inside a class, we don't actually have data assigned to it because this has to be flowy. If I want to create a car, I want to be able to decide what kind of brand and which color it's going to be when I create the object. And if I were to set it equal to Volvo and green inside the property itself now, it is actually going to be predetermined, and I don't want to have that. So we're just going to go ahead and say that we have a brand and we have a color, but we don't know exactly what those information are going to be yet. So that is going to be for later once we do actually create a object based off this class here. If you do have some sort of information that you do want to have predefined inside a class, you can do so. So let's go ahead and create a third property in this case here. We could have something called vehicle type. So vehicle type, if that is how you spell it. And I'm just going to go ahead and set it equal to car, just so we know that this is going to be a car type. And just one more thing before we move on from properties, I do want to mention that these are also called fields. So, right now we would actually call these properties, but we do also have another word called fields. So we can say /fields. And this is something that some people may ask about because in other programming languages, for example, like in C#, we do have something called fields, and then we do have something else that are called properties, which we'll also talk about in this video here, which is called getter and setter methods. But in other programming languages, we do actually call those properties, and these would then be called fields. But in PHP, these are referred to as properties, weirdly enough. So it's not exactly the same thing as some other programming languages. So just know that in PHP, these are called properties. So now let's go ahead and talk about a constructor. So let's go ahead and make a comment here and say we have something called a constructor. Now a constructor is basically a method inside this class, so basically a function that is going to run whenever you create a object based off this class here. So again, remember this class is a blueprint. So when I want to create a car based off this blueprint here, we run this function here in order to run some code to do something when the object is created. And this is where leaving these empty comes in handy, because what we can do is I can go down here and I can create a public function. And I'm going to call this one underscore underscore, so 2 of them, construct, parentheses, and curly brackets. And this is how we create a basic constructor. And it is important to note here that this is a predefined word inside PHP to create a function that is going to run when you create an object. So this is one of the predefined functions inside PHP when it comes to object-oriented PHP that you do need to know. Okay, so this one method here is very important to know about. So what a constructor basically does is that it makes sure that whenever we create an object from this blueprint here, we can go ahead and assign some data to the brand and to the color that right now has no data assigned to them. So just like when we go inside our index page and we create a function and we pass in some parameters in order to fill in whatever information is going to be output inside the browser from inside the function here, we can also pass in this information inside an object in the exact same way. So let's go and go back to the car and say that whenever I want to create an object based off this class here, I want to be able to decide which brand and which color it's going to be, which means that I'm going to grab this property, or at least the name of it, and I'm going to pass it inside the parentheses down here, comma, and then the color. I'm going to paste that inside the parentheses. And then inside the function, we want to actually take the data that we pass into the object when we create it and assign it to these properties up here. So it's very important to point out here, because this confuses a lot of people. These over here are not these up here. Okay, they just have the same names. In the same way as you go back inside the index page and say that, okay, so we have these parameters here. These parameters are just placeholders. Okay, so the information that we have up here are going to get passed in when we actually call upon the function down here. So this variable and this variable is going inside the function when we actually call upon the function. The parameters up here are just placeholders. And that is the same thing when we go inside a class and we have these different parameters inside a constructor. So we're going to go inside the method down here, and I'm going to use a keyword called variable this, which points to this object here, or this instance of an object. Then I'm going to point to a property, which is right now called brand. So right now, this particular line of code here is actually how we refer to a property that is called brand, which means that I can now set this one equal to a piece of data that I pass inside the object when we create it for the first time. So I can set it equal to variable brand. And again, just to mention it one more time for people who might still be confused about this variable brand over here is not this variable brand up here, okay? This is the property inside this class. This down here is the data that we pass into the object when we create it for the first time, which is going to be this data up here. So we take this data and then we put it equal to the property inside this class here, which is this brand up here. So what we can do now is we can say, well, I do also have a color property that right now does not have anything assigned to it. So what we can also do when we create this object for the first time is to also go down and say I want to assign some data to that particular property. So we're going to pass in a color when we create this object, and then I want to assign it to my color property up here. Okay? So now at this point here, let's actually go and create a object based off this class here, because I do think it's going to make a little bit more sense to you if we do actually create an object to show exactly what the constructor does. So what I can do is I can go down here. Let's just go down a couple of lines, and I'm going to create a variable, which I can call something like car. Maybe we could call it car number 1, just to give it some sort of name. And I'm going to set it equal to a new instance of this class called car, parentheses, and semicolon. So now right now I can see, oh, it's giving me a error message. And that is because right now we told it that when we create an object, we need to pass in 2 pieces of data that is going to get assigned to our properties up here, which means that we need to go in and say, I want to pass in Volvo, and I want to pass in a color. So it could be, for example, green. And in this case, we now don't have any error messages because now we actually pasted in some information that is going to get assigned to our brand and color properties inside the class here. Okay, so this is how we can actually create an object. And what I can then do is I can say, well, this is a blueprint. So I can create a second car, and we can call this one car number 2. And this one could, for example, be a BMW. and it is going to be a blue BMW. So in this sort of way, we now have different copies of this car based off this blueprint. But now just to show one extra thing here that might be important to some people, let's say I don't want to decide on the color for the second car down here. Now it is going to give me a error message because we need to include the color, otherwise we're not doing this correctly, right? What we can actually do inside the constructor up here is you could actually assign some data, which is going to be a placeholder, which is going to get filled in if you do not submit some data, okay? So I could, for example, say here that we have none set for the color, which in this case is going to actually remove the error message down here, because now when I create car number 2, it is going to be a BMW, but it is not going to have a color assigned because now the default is going to be none if we do not assign a color. The first car though is still going to be green because this equal sign is only going to count if we do not include some data inside the constructor. And in this sort of way, we can just go ahead and create as many cars as we want. We can call this 3, 4, 5, 6, and we can just give some different information if we want to. This one could, for example, be a Toyota. And then we can pass in another color. This could be yellow, just to give it some sort of information here. But you kind of get the idea now that we can just keep creating copies of this class here because we now have a blueprint. And when we do actually have a object, so let me go ahead and delete this. So now because we have this object here, we can actually access any sort of properties and methods inside this class or inside this object here, as long as it has a proper protection level. So right now we can't actually access these properties up here because they're all set to private. But let's go ahead and set this bottom one to public, just to show an example here. What I can now do is I can actually take this object that we created, go down to the next line, and from here we can point to any sort of property or method from inside the class that we can actually access. So right now we can actually access our vehicle type because it is now set to public. So if we were to go down here, I can use this little arrow again that you may recognize from up here because we're now pointing to a property called get vehicle type. So we're to paste that in down here. We now refer to the property inside this object here called vehicle type. So if I were to actually echo this out inside my browser, so we can actually see this, if I were to go inside my browser here, go inside my directory and say I want to go inside classes /car.php, then you can see we get car. And why do we get car? Because that is what I set my property to. I can also, if I were to make this brand into a public protection level, I can also access this one. So I could, for example, go down here and instead of vehicle type, we could say brand. So in this sort of way, we can access properties and methods inside the class. And just to show how this looks like, if I were to actually make these private again, so if I were to go in here and say I want to make these private, and I also want to make this one private down here, you can now see that, well, first of all, you can see we get an error message, but if I were to go inside the browser and refresh, you can see that, oh, uncaught error, cannot access private property because it is private, so we're not allowed to access it from inside this object here. So now we talked about how to create an object based off a class that we created. So we have this class here, we have different properties, and we also have a constructor that assigns data to our properties. Now, one thing you might be thinking is, well, okay, so how can we use this object that we just created? What is the purpose of creating these objects here? Well, the purpose of an object is to be able to access any sort of properties or methods that we have inside a class or inside an object, because the object has all of these properties and methods inside of it. This means that I'm actually able to access properties, or I can go down and create a method on my own. So I can actually go down below this constructor here and I can say, well, let's go ahead and create a method. So I'm going to say we have a method, and I'm going to say we have a public function, and I'm going to call this the exact same thing as we did inside the index page. So if we were to go back in here, we have this little function here. So I can actually go ahead and grab this and I can paste it inside the class as a method. And we don't actually need to pass in any sort of parameters here because we do already have these properties up here. And these we can actually just access because they're inside this same class. So if I were to go down here and open up the curly brackets, I can go back inside my index page and just copy what I have inside this function here, because we're going to do the exact same thing, and paste it in. And instead of referring to these different parameters that we would typically inside a function pass inside the parentheses, instead I can actually go ahead and refer to this property. So I can go inside and say this property called brand is going to get referred to. And then I'm going to do the same thing when it comes to the color. So instead, we're going to go down and paste in the property called color. So this is how you would access a property from inside the class, because remember, we did actually set these properties to private, which means that we cannot access these properties unless it's from within the same class. So because this method we created down here is inside the same class, this method can access this property up here because it is private. And because this method is set to public, it means that after we create an object based off this class here, I can actually go down below and I could, for example, echo variable car number1, because that is the name of the object. And I can go and point to a method, which right now is called getCarInfo, parentheses. And we can run these properties or methods in the same way as we would with variables and functions inside PHP. Things start to make sense. Now we could of course also go up here, and if I wanted to actually access one of these properties directly from outside the actual class, I could actually go in and say that maybe this particular property is going to be public, because let's say I have a reason to make it public because I need to use it outside the class itself. What I could do is I can go down here and do that, and I could go down below, just copy paste. And instead of saying I want to access this method here, I could just say I want to access a vehicle type. So I'm going to paste that in instead. And that is how we would access a property. So now we know how to access a property and a method from inside this class. So again, always set your protection level to private and then change it to public if needed. So if we need to access this method from outside the class, then we need to set it to public, and the same thing goes for properties. Now let's actually go ahead and include a break in between here, because I want to actually show you this inside the browser. So we're just going to echo out a HTML break because we can do that. And then I'm going to go inside my browser, and I'm just simply going to go inside my directory called classes, because we do have that inside our website here. So classes, and I'm going to access car.php like so. And then you can see we get the same thing, but we also get car below it because we also echo out the property. But now typically we don't really do this from within the same document. So right now, we have this class document and we create a object inside the same page, and that's not typically how we do things. Instead, what we would actually do is go inside, for example, our index page or any other page inside our website. And instead of doing all of this with functions, which is completely unnecessary right now, we could actually go ahead and delete everything, and we could go ahead and load in one of our classes. So we could say require_once in the same way as you would include any other document. And we could go in and say that I want to access classes / and then car.php, which means that now we have access to this class. So I can go below here and say I want to create a new object. So we can call this one car, and we can say car number1. And I'm going to set it equal to a new instantiated object based off the class called car, parentheses, semicolon. And then we just paste in the parameters that is required. So in this case here, we could say this is going to be I'm not really a car, guys. I'm just going to use BMW again. And we're going to go ahead and say it's going to have a color, which is going to be set to green. And then we can actually go back inside car and just delete the class object that we have down here, because we don't need it inside the same page. It was just to give you an example. So now we have it inside the index page instead, and we could also go down now and start accessing all these methods and properties as we did before. So I can say we have car number1, and I want to point to a property which is called car type. I think it was car type, vehicle type. Okay, so we're going to say vehicle type, and then we can actually echo this one out if we wanted to. And if I were to go back inside my website and actually go back to the front page, so the index page, you can now see that we get car. So I hope things are starting to make sense now, that we have a class that has a bunch of information about this class and a bunch of methods. So again, functions, so to speak. But now the way we've been doing things as it is right now is not really how you should be doing things, because right now we're accessing this property directly simply by just referencing to vehicle type and then printing it out inside the website. And this is something that I see a lot of people, they just do. Like they'll go in, and if they want to access vehicle type, they'll just make it public and then they'll access it this sort of way. And that is not actually how the proper, it's not best practice to access it in this sort of way. What we can do is, instead of accessing these properties directly by referring to them like this, just making them public and then printing them out, we can create something called a getter and a setter method. So we go down here and we can actually create a comment. So we can say getter and setter method. And what we're basically going to do here is we're going to create a method that is going to access a property, and we're going to create a method that is going to change the property. So if I want to change the brand or the color to something else, we can call upon one of these methods here and actually do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a function, and this one is going to be public. So we're going to say public function, and we're going to call this one get, and then the name of the property. So get brand with a capitalized B. And in this sort of way, we can now create a getter method and just simply go in and say we want to return variable this, point to our brand. And this would be a basic getter method, which now means that I can actually go inside my index page, and instead of accessing one of these properties directly, I can actually go and say I want to do a get brand and access it in this sort of way. So if we were to go back inside the website, you can now see we get the brand, which is called BMW. And this is called a getter method, but we do also have something called a setter method. So I'm going to copy paste this one down below, and I'm going to call this one set brand. So instead of get brand, we set it. So we actually set it to a new value, so to speak. So what I can do here is I can go inside, and instead I'm going to say I want to refer to this brand, and I want to set it equal to a new value, which is going to be variable brand. And this is actually going to be a parameter that we can pass inside this method when we call upon it outside the class, or after we instantiated the object, so to speak. So if we were to go back inside the index page, what I could do is right before is instead of calling upon get brand, I'm going to call upon set brand, and I'm going to change the value to, for example, a Volvo. So if we were to do this, again, what we're doing is we're creating an object, then we're going to change the brand of the car to Volvo, so now it's no longer BMW, and then we're printing it out inside our website. So if we were to go back down, refresh, you can now see that it is called Volvo. And this is how we do things in the proper best practice sort of way. Okay, so instead of changing things directly inside the properties up here, which in other languages, by the way, is called a field, and these down here are actually called properties in other languages. But because PHP is doing things a little bit different, and we're basically just creating a normal method and just calling them get brand and set brand, and the syntax isn't really much different than just creating a method, any other method like this one down here, you can see we do the same thing. We just create a public function, get car info, and then up here we just create a public function, get brand. So it's the same process. In PHP, they decided to just call these getter and setter methods because technically these are methods. But in other programming languages, if you do have a background in, for example, C#, we do not have a specific syntax, where we go in and actually say we call upon a get method and then we create a get method. So a little bit of confusion for new people here, but if you are a person with a little bit of experience, it's a little bit different. So now a couple of things to talk about when it comes to getter and setter methods, because yes, you do need to create one for all the different properties. So now we created one for the brand, which means we need to go down and also create one for the color. So instead of get brand, we're going to say get color. And we're going to do the same thing down for the set method. So we're going to say set color, and we're going to change it to color instead of brand. So we're going to say color. So we'll point to the color here. Change all the brand names to color, and just like that, we now have a getter and a setter method for our color. And just for now, let's go ahead and go back up inside the properties and just go ahead and delete this last property here, because this was more just to demonstrate that we could just set it equal to a certain value to begin with if we wanted to, but we don't really need it for the rest of these examples in this video here. So I'm just going to go and delete it here. So we don't need to create a getter and a setter method for that one either. So a couple of things about a getter and a setter method, because you may have some questions here. One thing is performance, because yes, this is kind of like a little bit more complicated. Instead of just saying, oh, I'm just going to set this one to public and then I'm going to access this directly inside my code by just saying I want to reference to color. That would just be the easy route, right? Doing it this way using a getter and a setter method is a slightly more complex way to do things because we are creating more code, essentially. Another thing is performance, which is slightly more performance heavy, not a lot, just a little bit. But the benefits of using getter and setter methods are much greater than not using them. One of the things you can do using getter and setter methods, and again, you can just sort of like Google what are the benefits if you want to see more. But one of the benefits is I could, for example, go inside my set color and say I'm only going to allow certain colors to be set inside when we change the color. So if I were to go down inside my set color, what I could do is I go inside and say I want to create an array. So allowed colors, and then I can set it equal to an array, semicolon, send it down. And I do have some values that I can just paste in here. So red, blue, green, and yellow. And basically what we're doing now is we're running a if condition. So we're going to say if a certain condition is true. So if we have in array, in underscore array, which is a built-in method or a built-in function inside PHP. And then I can simply go in and say, well, if this color that we paste in and feed this method here does exist inside this array up here, then I do want to allow for this color to be changed. So in this case here, I can go in and paste this in, and now we're only changing the color if we assign one of these colors up here. So if you use a setter method, we can now go in and actually run some custom code, and the same thing goes for getter methods, before we actually do return or change the value inside our properties up there. So again, if I were to go inside my index page here and say I want to get access to set colors, I'm just going to go and copy it here. And I'm going to say instead of get brand, we're going to go and access our set color. I can actually delete this one right here. And in this case here, I'm going to change it to green. So I'm going to copy paste this down, and we don't actually need to echo out the first one here because this one is just changing the value. But this one down here is going to be our get method. So we're going to get the color and simply run that one. So in this sort of way, we're changing the color and then we're echoing out the color afterwards using the getter method. And let's actually go and change this away from green because that is actually what it is already. So let's say yellow instead. So now we created an object that has a green car inside of it, and I say I want to change it to yellow. So if we were to do that and go inside the website, you can now see that we get yellow because that is allowed inside my array. But let's say I want to change it to something like white because I don't actually have that inside my array. So if we were to go back inside the website, you can see it's now green because we're not allowed to change it to white. And this is one of the big benefits of using getter and setter methods. And this is why you should be using these instead of just accessing these properties directly every single time. So again, just to summarize what we have here, we have a class that is called car, and we have properties or fields as they're also called. Then we have a constructor method, which is something that actually assigns values to these properties when we create the object for the first time. Then we have something called a getter and a setter method for each property, which is going to go in and either get the property or it's going to change the property. Then we have something called a method, which basically is just a function, again, doing this, that is directly related to this class here. And that is really the basics when it comes to a class, okay? There is much more you could talk about, but this is what you need to get started with Object-Oriented PHP classes. But we're not done yet. Because now your next question might be, well, okay, Daniel, what about a more realistic example? Because this is talking about, producing a car. But let's take, for example, if I have a sign-up system inside my website, because right now I do have a sign-up system video that shows how to create one using Procedural PHP. But we're going to do a much more simplified version in this little example coming up next that is going to show you how to create a very simplified and unsecure sign-up system. Again, just because I want to cut this video a little bit short, I don't want to extend this because this is another sign-up tutorial. But I do want to show you how to create a sign-up system, a very basic one using Object-Oriented PHP, so you can see the purpose of how we use classes instead of Procedural PHP. So let's go ahead and close down this car. And what I want to do instead is I want to go inside my classes. And first of all, I'm going to create a new file and call this one dbh, again with the capitalized D. So dbh.php. And this is going to be my database handler. So I'm going to open up my PHP tags, go down, create a class, and I'm going to call this one dbh. Now this one is going to connect to my database because, when it comes to getting information from a database or changing information or inserting users and that kind of thing, we do need to have a database connection. And typically the way we would do that is to have some variables that would have, for example, the host name, the database name, the username, and the password, right, for the database. And the way we just simply do that inside a class is just to put them in as properties. So we're going to say we have private host, private database name, private username, private password, and then we just have localhost, the name of the database, and then the username and password. Okay, so these are the properties inside the class. What we then do is just basically create a method that is going to go in and actually connect to the database. So again, I'm just sort of copy pasting things in here just because we don't want to write this out. This is not what the tutorial is about. But as you can see, we just have a very basic function or method in this case here, which is protected, and that will be explained in just a second. That is right now simply going in and creating a PDO object, which is a connection to our database. So we create a new PDO object and we just fill in the information. So we have the MySQL database, we have the host name pointing to this property up here, which is the property up here. So instead of just, having these being variables like we did inside my procedural example, in that other video that I mentioned, we're just going to refer to these properties up here. Then below here, we just go in and change some of the attributes to make sure that we have some error mode settings, so we have, exceptions and such things if something were to go wrong. And then we do also want to make sure we go down here and actually return this PDO connection. And that is one of the differences between the last procedural video and this one, is we do actually need to return the connection inside this method here. And then again, a error message if something were to go wrong. So a very basic PDO connection that we have talked about many times in previous courses. And just to mention here, because we have talked about creating a PDO object that is going to connect to our database in that procedural course. And I said, don't worry about it. We don't need to talk about objects yet. Now you might be able to see that, okay, so when we create this object, we just basically instantiate a new object based off a PDO class that is built into PHP with these parameters here. So this is the constructor method that is going to take information and assign it to properties inside this PDO connection object here. So you might start to see how this works, just by knowing how to create classes and objects and that kind of thing. So let's go ahead and talk about protected and the name up here. So basically now I just called this method connect. So instead of referring to PDO in the future when we have to connect to a database, then we would just use connect instead. And I did actually set this one to protected, not public. And the reason for that is that this is a very sensitive class, okay? This has our database connection, which means that any class should not be able to access this particular method. Again, we're trying to encapsulate our code as much as possible to make sure that we don't accidentally, or maybe if you're working with another developer, that they don't accidentally go in and mess with something inside this class here. So we want to make sure we encapsulate things and say that, okay, only child classes of this class are allowed to connect to our database. So what we can then do is save this file, and I can go inside my classes folder and create a new file. I'm going to call this one signup.php, again with a capitalized S because this is a class file. I'm going to open up my PHP code. I'm going to go down and create a class, and we're going to call this one signup. So now what I need to do here is talk a bit about how we do things in procedural PHP, because that will make more sense in just a second. So typically inside a index page, we would have a HTML form. So let's just go and delete everything that we have here and say that we have a HTML form. Okay, very basic example. We do also need to include a method. So this is going to be a post method. So inside our project, we would actually have another folder. So we're going to say we have includes folder that is going to have any sort of include file. So this is just going to be a bunch of PHP files that just run some PHP code. So again, if we were to submit this form, we send the data to include file, which in this case here is going to be called signup.inc.php. And do note here that I'm not capitalizing anything because this is not a class file. This is just a basic PHP file, okay? So we open up the code here, go down below, and we just basically do what we need to do. Again, it's very important to point out here, we're just doing basic PHP that we would also do if this was procedural PHP here, okay? So this is not object-oriented any sort of way so far, okay? So in here, what we would typically do is run a if condition that basically goes in and checks for a request method. So did we actually access this page correctly by submitting a form, which in this case should be a post method, which in this case we do because this is a post method. So if we access this page directly, using a post method. Then I want to go in and actually grab the data that the user submitted. So we do have, again, I'm just going to copy paste from my note over here. So we do have a username and a password. So we just basically go in and say we have this post method called username and a post method called password. And then we just basically want to do something with this information. We could sign up the user by simply go down and running some PHP code to sign up a user inside our website. But let's go and do that the object-oriented way instead. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to require, first of all, my database file, because we need to connect to the database. So we need to have that class available to us, right? So we're going to say we want to go back one directory because we want to go back and then go inside our classes folder. And inside our classes folder, we're going to access our dbh.php file. Then we're going to do the same thing, but this time we're going to access our signup file. And the order here does matter because we do need to have the database class first and then the signup class. And the reason for that is that the signup class is going to be a child class of the database class. So the parent class goes first and then the child class goes after. And again, we haven't really talked about how to make this signup class a child class. We'll do that in just a second, okay? But the order here does matter. So what we need to do now is go back inside our signup class and we need to create our properties. So we need to ask ourselves, okay, so in order to sign up this user, what properties do we need to have? So which variables do we need to have? And this is actually told to us already, because if we were to go back inside my signup.inc.php file, we have two variables here. So we need to use the information that the user gave us in order to sign up the user, right? So if we were to go back inside the signup class, I'm just going to create two properties, which are going to be these two pieces of information. So I'm going to create a private username and a private password, and these are going to be my properties. Then we're going to create a constructor because we need to assign some data to these properties because right now there's nothing assigned to them. So if we were to create a public constructor, which is going to take in a username and a password and assign it to these properties down here, we can do that in this sort of way. So now if I were to actually go back inside my signup.inc.php file, go down below here and say I want to create a new object, which is just going to be called signup, just because we need to call it something. And this one is going to be set equal to a new instantiated object. So this one is going to be a new signup class that we are instantiating into an object. And we're going to paste in two pieces of information, which in this case is going to be a username. And we do also need to paste in a password. So just going to paste that inside our class or inside our object here. So if I were to go back inside my signup class, we now just need to ask ourselves, well, what do we need this class to do? Well, we need to sign up the user, right? So we need to have a query that actually goes inside our database and queries the database. And this is what we need to talk about making a child class, because right now this signup form needs information from another class in order to properly work, because we need to sign up a user, which means we need a database connection. And we do have a database connection inside our DBH class. So because this one has a protected method which can actually connect us to the database, I can go inside my signup class and include something called extends inside our class name up here. And we're going to extend our DBH class. So now we're basically saying that the DBH class is the parent class and the signup class is a child class of the DBH class. And this now means that I can actually go inside and access any sort of protected methods inside this class here, because now we are a child class. So I can use this method here called connect in order to connect to our database. It is also important to note here that the reason we can do this is of course because we need to have the database class first actually accessed inside this document and then the signup class below. This is the same thing as if you were to take all the code inside the DBH file and put that right inside this file here, right where this line of code is. Instead, we just paste the entire class in here, and then we take the signup class and paste it directly below. So in this sort of way, you can see how the ordering matters, because we need to load in the database class first and then the signup class, right? So going back inside the signup class, what we can do is we can actually try and insert the user inside the database. So I can go below here and say I want to create a new private function or private method. And I'm going to call this one insert user. And basically inside this one, we first of all need to query the database. So we need to create a query statement. I'm just going to wrap everything here. So we create a query statement that basically just goes in and creates an insert statement into a users table inside our database. We're going to include a username and a password. The values are going to be placeholders because we need to do this using prepared statements, of course, because that is going to prevent SQL injection. So that is important. And then I'm going to go below here and just do the same thing as we would using procedural PHP. So I'll go in, create a statement, which is a prepared statement, and I'm going to connect to our database by using this and then point to connect. So in our procedural course, we would actually call this one variable PDO because that is our connection. But in this case, since we want to access this method in here, which is called connect, I need to refer to this class and a connect method. And it is important to note here that yes, even though we say this class, we do also talk about the class that we extend to. So you can write this class and then the connect method, but I do also want to mention another thing here, which is something that could potentially cause you to run into an error. So let's say I were to go above this particular method here and were to create another, let's just call this one a private method. And if I were to call this one connect and just create a method inside my signup class called connect, then we run into a small issue because if I were to point to this class and then connect, it is going to prioritize this particular connect method inside this class here and not the one inside the parent class. So what you can do if you have a method with the same name inside two different classes, instead of using this keyword, is you can use something called parent : which is going to refer to the parent class called connect. So in this sort of way, we can do things in a better way because we don't accidentally access a method from inside this class when we actually meant to access a method from inside the parent class. So we can use this keyword here instead of writing this class, okay? So just a small example, just to demonstrate something. So now we're pointing to a connect method from within this class or inside the parent class, and we just simply prepare the query. So again, basic PHP here. This is a basic prepared statement. Then we bind the parameters. So we go in and say that this placeholder up here and this placeholder is going to have filled in some information, and that is going to be from the properties from inside this class here. So the properties that we assigned up here. Then we just go down and we execute the code, which means that now the user is being signed up inside the website. But we do need to talk about something else, because it is a very good idea to separate functionality inside a class in the same way as it's a very good idea to separate functionality using different functions. So right now we have one method that just basically goes in and queries the database, and that is good. So we have a insert user method that only queries the database. But what about everything else? Because we need to do error handling and different conditions and just basic PHP code to make sure that the information submitted by the user is actually correct. So what we're going to do is we're going to create another method. So I'm just going to copy paste the name here, paste it below, and I'm going to instead go in and call this something else. So in this case, we could say sign up user. And then inside sign up user, we basically just run all the different error handlers that we need. So we can say error handlers, like checking if there's any sort of empty inputs or if this is a proper username or a proper password, that kind of thing. And then we just basically sign up the user if that is the case. So again, error handler, write another comment that says, if no errors, sign up user, right? So we have basic code in here. So before signing up the user, let's go and create just a basic error handler. So what I could do is I can go above here and say I want to actually check if there's any sort of empty input submitted. So what I could do is I'm just going to copy paste from my notes here. I do have a method that basically just goes in and checks is the username property actually containing any sort of value, and the same thing for the password inside, the properties inside this class here. And if so, then return false because there's no error messages. But if they do not have any sort of info, just one of them, then return this as true, which means that we do have an error message. And then we go inside our sign up user function or sign up user method. And then we go in and run a basic if condition, where we go in and just run a if condition that checks if this method that we just created up here is returning as true, meaning that there is an error. So if there is an error message, then we just basically go in and run a header function to return the user to the document root, which is our main directory of the website, and then send them to the index.php file. So basically just sending them to the index page if there is some sort of error message, and then we kill the script that is going on right here. Then below here, if there was no error, so if we did not encounter this error message, then I do just want to go in and sign up the user. So we can just basically go in and say that we have this method called insert user, which is up here, which is the query statement, and just basically sign up the user. So now we have a very basic class that can handle going in and grabbing some user information and then assigning data to it right inside the properties using a constructor method. And then we have a basic method that just goes in and queries the database and actually signs up the user. And just keep in mind, this is a very sensitive method because we're interacting with the database. So this one is set to private. I don't want this to be run outside the actual class, okay? That is why this one is private. And we do also have a private method down here that is called isEmptySubmit, because we're basically just checking for a particular error handler. So in this case here, we don't need to run this outside the class right now or outside the object. So it's okay, this one is private for now. If you at a later point might want to run this outside the actual class, then just make this one public. But for now, just private is okay. Again, always make it private first, and then if you have a reason to use it outside when you have created the object, then make it public. For now, we don't have a reason to. And then again, we just have a basic method down here that is called signup_user that is going to sign up the user inside the website. Now, one thing we need to change here is that I do need to run this method outside when we have created an object, because inside my signup file, I do need to go below here and actually run a method from inside this object we just created. So I'm going to say we have an object called signup, and I'm going to point to a method called signup_user, parentheses. But you can see we get an error message, undefined method. And that is because right now this one is set to private. So we do need to use this method outside the object in order to actually sign up the user. So this one has to be public. So if we would do that, go back inside, you can now see the error message disappears. And now we can actually run this method in order to sign up the user. And just like that, we have a basic sign up system, a very basic one, because we did miss quite a few things. There was supposed to be many more error handlers, session security, all that kind of thing. We didn't even close off the statement and the database connection, even though you don't technically have to, but it's a good practice to do so. Again, very bare bone example, but just to prove a point that you can use a class instead of using variables and functions inside your code in the procedural way. There's also one more thing I want to point out here, which is that inside our car example, we did actually went ahead and created all these getter and setter methods. You should also do that, of course, inside this one here. You should also have a getter and a setter for the username and password. So with that, we now know how to instantiate an object based off a class and actually have an example of how to use this in a real way, instead of just showing you how to create classes and objects and then you're left for yourself to figure out how to use them. So in this case here, I wanted to give you an example of how we could actually use them in the same way as we would using procedural code. Okay, so with this little crash course, I guess, in object-oriented PHP, I hope you enjoyed this lesson and had a better understanding of how this works. Again, this is like the introduction to object-oriented programming. We haven't talked about design patterns like the MVC model, but let's not get into design patterns now. Just know there's something called design patterns, and a very popular one is something called a MVC pattern, which is the one that I prefer to use in my tutorials here. So I hope this made sense, and I hope this gave you not just an idea about how to create object-oriented PHP, but also how to use it inside your code. So with that said, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.